Welcome to the Organizational Transformation Kung Fu Podcast with your hosts, Sandi Verrecchia and Jennifer Long.
Welcome to this episode of Organizational Transformation Kung Fu, or OT Kung Fu, as we like to call it. I'm Sandi Verrecchia, an executive coach in Toronto, Canada, at Satori Consulting, and I'm joined here by my co-host, Coach Jen Long in Denver, Colorado, at Management Possible. Hey, Jen.
Hey, Sandi. How are you?
I'm great. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Good. So you'll recall, Jen, back in the winter, we recorded a podcast on diversity and inclusion. And at that time, we had a focus on defining what the difference was between the two words that are often used together. And we took a bit of a stab at looking at it from, is it a box ticking exercise for organizations or is it a strategy? And if it's box ticking, then it's a one and done. It's crossed off the list to do, and it's done. But if it's a strategy, then it permeates the thoughts and behaviors of everyone and becomes systemic within an organization. So like the art of Kung Fu, organizational change, such as embracing diversity and becoming a fully inclusive organization, takes time, requires patience, and energy for you to master it. So this podcast, we're focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we're thrilled to have Renee Bazile-Jones join us here today. Renee is well known in Canada and the US for her work in diversity and inclusion management, strategic planning, and management of change. And as a subject matter expert on DE&I, we're really super excited to have Renee with us today. So welcome, Renee.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
We are very excited to have you. And so one of the first questions we wanted to ask is, because it started when Sandi and I did this several months ago, and we were doing diversity and inclusion, where somewhere an E showed up and it turned into diversity, equity, and inclusion. So can you maybe give us a little bit of background on how you define all that? And where did the E come from? What's going on there?
That's a great question. I think the E actually came first. When you think about equity, it is a redefinition of fairness. And so what most organizations have been built on is the idea of equality, where you treat everybody the same. But equity suggests that you individualize your treatment and you see people as the unique individuals that they actually are. And so that treatment with respect to the workplace in terms of word and deed is very much individualized. And that is a shift in paradigm, if you will, in terms of the way that organizations traditionally work. When you think about diversity, it really is about what makes individuals unique. So it's about differences that you can see, but it's also about differences that you can't see. So the traditional focus with respect to diversity is usually around race and gender. But there are other aspects of diversity, such as diversity of thought, how people approach problem solving, and those dimensions of identity that you can't see with the naked eye. And so when you think about equity, it's the flex of how do I recognize and acknowledge all of those individual differences. Inclusion is very different thing. It speaks to behavior. It speaks to mindfulness. And whether or not at the end of the day, all of the individuals in an organization feel that they're being treated with dignity and respect, and that what they contribute to the organization is also recognized and acknowledged. Doesn't just happen, really does require individuals to be mindful.
Wow. So a lot to unpack in there. We got flex and we have mindfulness, all the different ways that diversity shows up. And so should those three words be used together, like all the time?
Well, I think it's kind of trendy language. So, when I started working in this area 150 years ago, it was all about equity, but more specifically employment equity, and it was legislative driven. And so when we think about where we are in current time, I would suggest to you there's an overemphasis on diversity and not enough on inclusion. If you have the underpinnings of an organization in terms of infrastructure, and that's based on anti-discrimination laws, et cetera, you have the platform for equity. But the truth of the matter is, equity is just a component. And in a lot of cases, it focuses on, okay, only numerical differences, things that I can see. And am I treating these people the same way? Am I treating them fairly? So I think, I would love to see a shift and talk more about inclusive workplaces, because that's the day-to-day experience that people have. When the three of us are interacting, the question is, are we going to treat each other respectfully? And so I would love to see that shift and more emphasis on the inclusion aspect of all of this.
For sure, for sure. So, on that note, so talk to us a little bit about the work that you're actually doing in the DE&I space, in terms of what is a typical company doing?
Well, I think if I can reference what you said before, I think the strategy part of this is really important. One of the things that I've learned in doing this work is that organizations focus on measurement and analytics for almost everything except their people. What they usually do is just count. And so when you think about the idea of working from information and not just the highest paid person's opinion in the room, you need to understand just sheer data. Who's a part of our workforce? How do they feel about their treatment in the workplace? And so that beginning piece is really important. And the reason I started there is because it hopefully leads you to strategy. The dilemma with most organizations is they do employee engagement surveys, for example. The problem with those is that the demographic identification is not deep enough. So it's usually name, rank, serial number, in some cases geographics, when people are doing employee engagement surveys. But what you actually need is a much deeper dive in terms of identity. So all of the things that we think about when we think about what makes people diverse. So it's race, it's gender, it's gender identity. It's all of those things that you need to really establish as your demographic basis for asking questions. And the questions you want to ask are inclusion questions. And what that allows you to do is to analyze that information by identity. So where you start to see standard deviations of difference in response, it can pinpoint differences such as sex. So if more women say that the organization is unfair than men, then you can pretty much highlight the idea that you probably have sexism in your organization. So once you have that very
Mhm.
clear data, it allows you to populate a really fulsome strategy. And so that's the piece that is the biggie right now. But the other thing I think that's certainly in terms of what's informed my work more recently, really over the last couple of years, is a focus on unconscious bias training. And, unfortunately, people see that as the panacea to all of the things that we see occurring in current time. It's really hard to watch the news right now. It's been hard to watch the news for quite a long time. But you see these issues played out
for a while.
for a
Yeah.
while. And, the people are saying, well, the whole
Mhm.
basis of this is unconscious bias, forgetting infrastructural discrimination. And so that's a piece of the work that I'm doing now. Also looking at the role of leaders. What is the job of leaders in building an inclusive workplace environment? And what does that actually look like? The other piece of this is behavior based. I do a lot of learning programs around respect in the workplace. And what does that actually mean? Because my experience is that each of us as individuals has different definitions of what respect actually is. And so a lot of that focus sometimes gets stuck on workplace harassment. By the way, those issues have not gone away either. I'm sort of surprised at that. And part of my work is doing general discrimination investigations and trying to uncover what issues are happening in a particular workplace. And I have to say, a lot of that really ties to organizational culture and what's acceptable behavior and what's unacceptable behavior. So that, when you're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's an underpinning as well.
Right. I want to
Wow.
stop and talk about leadership, because one of the things that comes up is how do we measure whether we're being successful? And one of the ways that we hear a lot is that leaders are being compensated on diversity and inclusion, which says to me that they're getting, do we have enough of gender diversity, or do we have enough that sort of, like, again, do we have enough ethnic diversity in our group? And yes, we do. So great, then I get a bonus. So how do you use a bonus structure? Like, well, that doesn't work, I guess. Can you compensate on leadership to get the job done in that way?
I think you can with respect to results. So is it part of performance management? But if you step back from that just for a second and say, what are you actually trying to accomplish? And so what tends to happen is this over focus on what I call representation. So representation is pretty much a numbers game. It's about counting people, not necessarily making people count. And so when you look at performance management in the DE&I area, and you say, "Oh, we're compensating our leaders." Well, what are you actually compensating them for? The fact that they've increased representation of certain groups. That's a short-term benefit. And the truth of the matter is, and this goes back to what I suggested about measurement and analytics, if you look at who's staying and who's going in organizations, what most organizations don't do, and unless somebody asks them to do it, is to actually look at the patterns around that. And so where you see higher turnover for certain identities, even if you're compensating managers for increasing representation, it's not going to work. And so this overemphasis on numbers means that you're not examining the quality or the caliber of the workplace environment. So what do people actually experience when they're a part of your organization? And if you're not compensating, or you're not making that a performance requirement for managers, what we found out, that employment equity legislation, which has the same focus on numbers, has been in place since 1986 in this country. And 99.9% of organizations have not reached their targets. And so you have to ask yourself why. It all comes back to the caliber of the environment that people experience. And so while I think it might be a great idea to make DE&I objectives a part of a leader's package and expectation about how they lead, I think you need to be more careful about what are the parameters around that and what are you actually trying to achieve.
Right. That's really, are there other things? So aside from the package and the measuring, I'm curious, when we look at the training and the efforts around behaviors and whatnot, in terms of what are the key leadership, when you look at the outcomes of some of these trainings, and so the unconscious bias, whatever behavioral things, what are those outcomes for leaders in terms of what should they be doing specifically different?
Everything.
Everything.
No, that's not true.
Including the khaki pants. Get rid of the khaki pants.
But it is, I think, one of the urban myths about inclusive leadership is that it has to be markedly different than just positive leadership. So when you think about who are the best leaders that you've ever had, what were the characteristics? What did they do that left you feeling that they were really good leaders? And so when you think about inclusive leadership, it's building on that. What I'm finding is, in my conversations with a lot of leaders, is they're scared to death right now. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing. They don't know what to say to the people that report to them.
Yeah.
And you're sort of like, well, where have you been all this time? Do you have any construct or any concept of who it is that you're working with, who it is that you're leading? So I think that's probably, for me, one of the biggest questions to start with. And to invite leaders to think about, what does it take to be an inclusive leader? And so those characteristics are really about the idea of wonder, for example, being curious about what's happening, what's happening in your business, what's happening with the people that you work with. So a fundamental, I think, to inclusive leadership is having that sense of wonder. It's also about the idea of being willing to acknowledge that you don't always know what you don't know. One of the things that I find in my conversations with leaders as we're doing this kind of learning program is, Do you have any clear understanding of who it is that you're dealing with? And are you mindful of the idea that your treatment of the people that you lead has to be very individualized? It's gotten more complicated, if you will, in terms of what makes good leadership.
Mhm.
Because it used to be that you could have a sort of one size fits all style or approach to leadership, and knew that because you were dealing with a relatively homogeneous workforce, those techniques worked. But leaders are being asked more and more to step up now and say, how do I individualize my treatment? It's more work. And I can tell you quite frankly that a lot of leaders are saying, wow, with all the other things on my plate, with all the other priorities that I have, I'll give you what I call a quotable quote. One leader said to me, hey, I just don't have time to be fair. And that is the essence of all of this.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, you don't.
You don't. And how does that play out for you in terms of
It's a
your
luxury.
opportunities for success
Yeah.
and the success for the people that you're leading? And I think it's also that paradigm shift of moving away from being a manager to being a leader. And what does that mean? It means that you're demonstrating that you have faith in the competency of the people that you lead, and that you're not hovering, if you will, or you're not trying to take over
Yeah.
the work that's been assigned. I think that's certainly a hallmark of really positive, inclusive leaders. But the truth of the matter is, if you had to net this out, inclusion happens in terms of what people see in their day-to-day interactions. It's really small things that make people feel included and a part of the conversation that we have. If I can give you an example of that, think about being in a meeting with 5 people and you're the leader and you're running this meeting. What have you done to ensure that you've recognized and acknowledged each person in that meeting based on how they self-identify? So if somebody says, I'm an introvert, you're pretty assured that they're not going to just burst out with lots of information during that meeting unless they have a really high comfort level. But the idea of inclusion there is to solicit opinion from that introverted person, or to take that moment before a meeting to say, here's the content of the things that we're going to talk about. I recognize that you may not always be comfortable speaking out, so I'd love to get your opinion on this. I want to give you a few minutes to think about how you might contribute. It's those little things that make people feel
Which is
included.
good, but right? But that's like teaming 101,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If you're a good team lead, you should be doing that anyway. So it shouldn't be that big of a leap.
No.
But you know what? It's
And
for a
so is it
lot of people,
because
it's a yeah, but. Yeah, but
Yeah.
how do I actually do
Yeah.
Yeah,
this?
exactly. I just got to get stuff done.
Yeah.
So I got to railroad the voices in the room. And it's like, why are you meeting? Just,
Just do
why
it.
is it a team?
Yeah. Yeah. Jen and I have talked a lot over the last few years about management versus leadership and the whole skill gap of leaders today, and trying to backfill it, right? Because we all know people get elevated because of their competence and their functionally, and not so much for their leadership skills,
Or
and
based on who they know.
or based on who they know, for sure. But I think one of the issues that comes up is that what you talked about is the fact that everybody is so busy. That's all I hear, the word, I'm just so busy, and just so frazzled. How do you make time for wonder? Like, how do you shift somebody's mindset so that they really think that taking time to wonder and to pause and to be curious is a good thing that has an outcome that, well, doesn't have to be measurable, but yeah, it has to be measurable.
Yeah, it kind of does. And you put your finger on something really important. And the basis for all of this is about mindset. It is about the idea of the reassurance of my own competency, right? Because I've had conversations with leaders where they say, I got promoted into this position, but I really feel like an imposter. I'm really not quite sure what to do. And so all of those things, I think, come together, and it becomes really important, I think, to ask people to explore what their mindset is. It's the fundamental to how we navigate, particularly in workplaces. And, what are we actually looking for, and what do we actually see as success parameters to positive leadership. And I think that that's also a conversation that we have a lot. Another conversation that I'm having a lot right now is how to have difficult conversation. So if you look at the chaos that we're all trying to live through right now, the convergence of COVID and issues around Black Lives Matter, anti-Asian hate, all of these things are coming together. And the question for leaders and organizations, let's not just put this all on leaders, is how do you respond to that in a meaningful way? And some of the conversations, I've been doing a lot of what I call listening sessions with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but also white people, because I think it's important that everybody's voice gets heard if you're talking about being inclusive. And one of the resounding things that's coming out of those conversations is that leaders are expected to somehow address these issues, and they're completely freaked out. They have no idea how to address any of these issues. And so
I didn't sign up for a social agenda.
Exactly. And so it leaves them frozen and really afraid. And I think it speaks to the kind of accusatory conversations that people often find themselves in organizations. You're not doing enough, or if you do something, you're doing it wrong. And so I think that having the skill set to engage in conversations, but a part of me, as I said, I've been doing this work for over 30 years, and a part of me sort of has to chuckle at the idea that somehow you have to teach people how to talk to other human beings, and the stratification there.
Right? It's like, just relax into it. Yeah.
Right?
But so connect the dot for me on the mindset and the unconscious bias. Does the understanding around unconscious bias help a leader, help a manager to really come to terms with what your mindset might be that you're not tapped into?
It can be, if you're willing to go there. And so this is the difference, and you referenced this before, Jen, about ticking the box. A lot of these unconscious bias programs are tick the box programs. But it goes back to what we were talking about before. If you're measuring me on the execution of that, then I'm probably going to pay a little bit more attention while I'm sitting through these programs. But I think there is a direct connection between mindset and bias. I mean, this is back to the brain science around bias, that each of us is hardwired to be suspicious of difference. That's our amygdala, the ancient part of our brains kicking in. It's something that we as human beings have in common, and often doesn't get pointed out to people unless you're really thinking about, how does this actually have an impact on how I see the world? So worldview and mindset, in terms of those connectors when it comes to people, places, and things, is something that people don't often contemplate unless you ask them to. Most of us kind of navigate through our day. We're not necessarily that introspective, but also because we've been shamed about the idea that we might have a bias about an individual or a group of people, it tends to shut us down. And so we end up in that frozen position. And the question becomes, how do I get unstuck? Because that lens, that if I have a bias about an individual or group of people, becomes the only lens that I see them through, unless somebody does an intervention and says, here's a different lens, here's a different way. It's also based on where our biases come from. So I was talking about the idea of reliable sources of bias, because they are reliable. I mean, our instinct, which ties back into our brains about keeping us safe and understanding that we are hardwired to be suspicious of difference on that basis. Think about the people in your upbringing. They usually have a certain level of authority in your life, and you usually give them a certain level of trust. So all of those entrenchers in terms of bias, as well as how we self-identify. So if you think about diversity dimensions and you say, one of the things that's really important to me is that I'm a parent. Well, we see how that plays out in workplaces, that if you're working with people who aren't parents, you may institute as a leader and as a group certain rules of operation that don't serve parents well. Or for people who aren't parents, they may be put upon in a more intensive way simply because of the bias that they don't have the level of responsibility that parents have. And so that convergence is really, from my experience, is really important to help people understand, but also to not beat them up for not having that information or knowledge. And so, my experience is I'm talking to a lot of people when I say, how are you doing in current time? The words that I'm generally getting are depressed, stressed, anxious, and freaked out. Now, freaked out is probably my interpretation of that. But the level of stress that people are experiencing right now, unless they have really good resources, has an impact on their levels of engagement in the organization and their willingness to be inclusive. They're thinking, I have to deal with my own stuff. I'm not sure I have a lot of energy for somebody else's stuff. Or if I choose to go there, I don't feel like I have the proper tools to actually be able to execute being inclusive in a meaningful way.
Right. Meaningful being a really big key.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
right.
Again, that's subject to individual
Yeah.
interpretation.
I was right. I was going to backtrack just a second. As you were talking, my brain was kind of going back to at the beginning. You had talked about the surveys, and people just don't have the deep enough demographic to understand their workforce at a really kind of a meaningful level of what do I really have? Is there resistance for people to give up that information to be able to parse your demographic?
Yes and no. Some people are really comfortable
Let's
saying
see more.
saying who they are. Part of it has to do with what are you going to do with that information if I give it to you? So there's this whole, argument about can you collect demographic data on your workforce? Well, of course you can. The issue is how you're using it. It relates to the idea of privacy laws and what people are sharing. But the truth of the matter is the people who are the most reluctant generally have had a lived experience in that organization that wasn't that positive based on who they are. And so the key there is really to be honest about the idea that we're not doing as well as we could. Part of the reason that we're not doing as well as we could is that we don't understand the needs of the people who live in our organization. For planning, for understanding who's a part of the organization, it's really important for us to understand who you are and how the organization has an impact on you. And so one of the keys to success is a long-term communication strategy. Before you ask people to self-identify, be very clear about the boundaries around confidentiality, and also to talk to why are you asking this? What is this going to lead to? And so I think the organizations in my experience that have been the most successful, and when I say successful, getting an 87% or higher return on self-identification questionnaires, most of the organizations that I've worked with achieve that goal. In some cases, it's almost 100% consistently. And so the other part of it is, as human beings, we forget a lot. And if you've gone through the exercise once and you want to do it again, it's really important to remind people of what happened after the first time you did it, because they won't be remembering that. They'll be going, wait a minute, why do I want to do this? And so, I call it, did anybody come to visit you in your backyard as a result of you sharing this information? And most people go, oh, no, they didn't. And so again, you're trying to build on that initial success. So even if you get less than a 50% return the first time, you're able to leverage that experience with everybody else to bring more people in if that's the case. But you need that information. You need it to understand, in the future, we all know that the workforce is getting older. They're going to have different needs. As they age with respect to what happens in the workplace environment. That information is really, from my experience, really, really critical to have and to reassure people about what it's being used for. So I think that's one of the really key elements is to, because if you don't know who's a part of your workforce, it's really difficult to make meaningful change. And that is what we're talking about, which is what makes most people kind of nervous as well.
Mm-hmm. So tell me what a backyard visit might look like. So we've gathered this information, and it's probably 2 years between doing our surveys and gathering it again, seeing where our benchmark was. What do these backyard visits look like?
So what I mean by that is that it would be a negative interaction. So the idea of questioning somebody else's identity, you are not allowed to identify somebody's identity yourself as an outside observer. But, what people are afraid of is that somehow if let's use being a person with a disability, and more specifically being a person with an invisible disability, such as diabetes or Crohn's. Right? What happens if I reveal that to my employer? Does it have an impact on my opportunities within that organization? And simply put, does it mean um, people going to treat me differently based on having that knowledge? So that's the paranoia of people thinking somebody's going to come into my backyard and start questioning me, and they won't leave until I give them the answers that they want to hear. So I think that is a really critical piece of all of that activity to reassure people on that who has access to that information is very limited, and that it will be used in very specific ways. For example, if you are, let's say, a person with diabetes, well, maybe the organization thinking about having that information and a number of people having diabetes, they might decide from a corporate social responsibility point of view that they want to engage with the Diabetes Society, make contributions there, or ask people to volunteer there. So, I think what's important is to understand the positive aspects of this, because generally when you're asking people to self-identify, it brings up their worst nightmares about what it is that they have to say and how that information is going to get used.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We do a lot of strategy work, and this topic comes up now. And I think, and the top of everybody's agenda is that we need to have a strategy around this. Do you have a success story that you can share about an organization that has successfully embedded a culture of DE&I?
I do, and I actually have more than one, which makes me do my happy dance. But
Yay!
if you think about this, think about the umbrella of this being corporate social responsibility. So what does that entail? When you think about how you look at organizations, I'd invite you to think about it down two paths. One is attitude, and the other is infrastructure. So some things that organizations are doing is what they call sustainability, diversity, and inclusion strategies. So if you look at it from an attitude point of view, that involves intensive training around specific aspects or dimensions of diversity, LGBTQ2 squared community, for example, and helping people understand what I call vectors or headwinds that members of those groups face for racial minority groups. So what you're doing is doing training to look at attitudes. And yes, a part of that is the bias aspect of this. And I'm thinking of one organization specifically that I would call an elder on diversity and inclusion, but under sustainable growth. They have institutionalized learning programs about individual differences, about barriers that people face. What is discrimination? What is my role? So again, what they've done is created this knowledge platform, but they've connected it to the idea of individual responsibility. And so that attitudinal piece becomes really important, but it needs to be linked to the infrastructure. So things like employee resource groups, where you've created opportunities, they're institutionalized and they're funded by the organization to provide a voice for people who may be members of non-dominant groups in their workplace environment. It's also about things like if you go onto websites and you look at who's represented, they've done an extraordinary job of creating a cross section of visuals of people and celebrating the fact that they're a part of their organization. And you see it. I call all of this organizational propaganda, but it's good propaganda from a DE&I perspective. And so they've entrenched that. You can't go on to anything that they do or anything that they produce without seeing DE&I core values entrenched in that. So their website is a great example of that. They've also created what we call a supplier diversity program. So a percentage of their business is dedicated to minority businesses, and they've really stepped up here. They also do engagement programs with those businesses. So they're out casting their net saying, hey, we'd like to give you some of our business and not just the usual reliable sources. They have created that external view. They've also and this is really interesting. I think it's one of the great things that they do. They solicit opinions from their employees about which community groups they should be involved in and with. And as a result of that, those connections are driven by their employee population. They've established clear goals and strategies about how to increase the representation in their workforce. They've also gone out to community groups and they're funding. It's really interesting. One of the things that I find young people don't know is what opportunities are available to them. And one of the things that this organization, this company has done is they funded scholarships in universities, in colleges. They have these employee resource groups are connected to educational centers. And so they're invited as treasured guests, or as Oprah Winfrey used to say, honored guests, to come in and talk about the potential for jobs, things that might be available to you, how you need to tie your education to that. And they've specifically targeted underrepresented populations. And so they have this really strong community connection and they're sincere. I think the worst case scenario and lessons learned about this is if you look at the banks as employers and you look at their relationship with indigenous communities. For hundreds of years, the banks lived outside of indigenous communities, but there were no indigenous people working there. And so the reason I'm pointing out this particular organization as being so on top of that is because they understand that history. They also understand if they're working with indigenous communities that they're in it for the long haul. It's not a tick the box thing as we talked about before. And so these entrenched soliciting opinions, bringing members of the community into the organization and having those members of community understand the opportunities that are present, and then also talking about what the organization stands for. And they've done a really fabulous job of looking at culture barriers, organizational culture barriers. And they're very specific in terms of their strat plans, I should say, about ensuring that they're bringing the organizational culture along to make it more inclusive. And it is the responsibility of everyone who works there to be a part of that. So that for me, that's, if I had to pick one organization, the celebratory aspect of all of the things that they're doing. Again, I don't get to do my happy dance often, but about them, absolutely, I would say they are well
So
known.
it's doable.
It is, it is. But
Ah.
the thing I would point out is that people think that they have to do everything at the same time. So if you were doing any business strategy, it would be laid out and you would have very specific things year over year that are measurable. And you say, okay, we've accomplished that. We move on to the next thing. So, if there's anything I would say to organizations, no, you don't have to do this all at the same time. You need to start by understanding where are we in
Right.
current time and what's our vision for ultimately for that inclusive workplace. And between that starting point and that end point, just like any other business plan, you would put certain things in strategically, you build the tactics into it, measurable, and then you would say, well, we may have to adjust these depending on what's going on with the business, et cetera. But when it comes, if you think of diversity and inclusion being about the leadership around people resources, the most important one that organizations have, then it needs to be a case of having that focus. So every business objective that you set has a people component. Diversity and inclusion has not made that different. It's only made the people who are a part of that component different. And so, how do you leverage the talents of that diverse group of people to achieve your objectives becomes a part of the conversation. And if they're traveling down different paths, and that's the organization I just talked about has integrated all of this. And I think that is really key for organizations. If this is sidebar or side path, you're probably going to fail.
Yeah, right. What so as you're talking through this, it's exciting because it's doable and you can start to see it when you get into the strategy, right? You can really start to understand all the piece parts of your own organization. What are or maybe the biggest couple of difficult conversations that have to go on? Because in the back of my head, I can hear some of my clients who are the white men who are like, yeah, well, I guess my day's over, and they, that whole,
Yeah.
right. They automatically go to the pity party and victim place of, okay, well, I'm not getting promoted.
Yeah. Well,
How do you,
I think you have to,
let's talk about that for a second.
I think you have to call people on their bull, first of all, in the kindest way possible, right? But I think it is important to say, what are we actually talking about here? Because the truth of the matter is, if you look at organizations historically, they have not worked on an equity model. People have used their privilege, and I invite people to hear that not from a guilt or blame place, but an understanding place, that there are, let's get real about the idea that certain groups have privilege. And if you say, and again, we're going back to organizational propaganda, for example, we only hire the brightest and the best people. I mean, if I had a dime for every time I'd heard that, I would probably be on an island somewhere and not talking to the two of you. Right? But it is. I mean, that's the basic tenet. And the belief is on the part of most people who the incumbents is that that's how they got their position. And they may not necessarily have the lens to see anything else. And so it's really important to get real about that, not from a guilt or blame place, but to understand, what are the privileges that people employ and enjoy? And are we being honest about that with each other? Not from a pointing fingers point of view, but from an idea that if we say we believe in a fair and equitable workplace, what are the barriers? What's our willingness to examine those? And without it becoming just a blame game. Because I think in a lot of organizations, and particularly if I can be honest about that, the straight, white, able-bodied men share this with me all the time. I've just lost my opportunity because people like you, Renee, are going to take over. And part of that is it's a good thing that people like me are taking over, but not at your expense. So I think that message has to be, the idea of what are the lenses that we're seeing people through when we bring them in, when we advance them? What are the traps? What are the black holes associated with process that we use right across the organization? And are we willing to confront that level of privilege to understand what the barriers are for people who are not members of dominant groups? Because let's get real. I mean, straight, white, able-bodied men are complaining about that. They're still, for the most part, when you look at executive teams, they're still the majority in those teams. I'm doing a session tomorrow with a senior leadership group, president and executive vice presidents. In a group of 9, there's one woman. There are no people of color. There isn't an Indigenous person anywhere near. And so you have to ask yourself, what are the barriers that are preventing people from advancing? And it's as simple as sitting in on a high potential meeting, having a woman age 35 identified as ready now to be promoted, and having one senior leader around the team say, well, I'm not so sure about her. And having everybody else say, well, what's the problem? Oh, she's a potential breeder. That's a quote from the person who had the objective. The idea that this young woman was,
wow.
yeah, I think it's all going in the book. I have a whole file of, I can't believe somebody said that. It's the part of the
That
joy
happened
of
to me.
Yeah, like scary shit my dad says.
Yeah.
But,
No, that actually happened to me. That actually.
Oh my gosh, you're kidding.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
No.
So
I had a district vice
whereof I
president.
speak.
Mike, I won't say his last name. Yeah. And at the time, I was furious, and I went to HR, and HR said, "Well, you have a choice. You can be vocal, or you could not. And if you're vocal, you'll have to weigh the consequences."
Mm-hmm.
Now,
And
this
there
was
are still
30 years ago,
consequences.
probably, but
yeah, I mean, I would love to tell you those consequences are gone,
Yeah,
but
huge political consequences.
political, and also,
Yeah.
you will
Yeah.
never see a promotion if you decide to complain about the inequities
No.
that exist now. It's heartbreaking. I mean, I still get calls from people because they know that one of my areas of specialty is workplace harassment, and they'll get a referral from somebody. Oh, call Renee, ask her 5 questions that you want to ask. And I still have to tell people when they call me that if they've been put on performance review without any indication that their performance was off at all, the sad news is, if you've made a complaint about workplace harassment and this is where you are now, I'm telling you to dust off your resume because they're going to out you. You're going to be gone, right? And nothing you do in terms of trying to improve your performance will change that outcome. So we still have a lot of work to do in terms of what people experience. But as I say that, I'm also really happy about the amount of work that's been done and the idea that we're at a place where people are actually seeing the lived experience of other people in their organizations. And I think that is an opportunity right now. Because, if I had to say, what's the one thing that still it surprises me about this experience of this is how much people still don't know about the lived experience of other people in their organizations. They make the assumption that their lived experience is that of others. And, I hate to say it, but I think that George Floyd's daughter was right. That horrible, horrible thing happening has kind of taken the Band-Aid off of people's eyes in a really extreme way. But it's forced us to ask questions about, when we bring that back into organizations and thinking of them as microcosms of society at large, what's actually going on in our organizations? We need to talk to each other. We need to understand what people are facing. So I think even as, we have to live through things that perhaps we thought we'd never live through. And by the way, I'm having a lot of conversations with people that only happens in the US. Well, no, it doesn't. And so it's really important
No.
that we're honest about the
Everywhere.
global aspects of all of this as well. But I think it is an opportunity time if we don't let it slip away and we don't do the 15-minute thing with it as well.
Well said.
Exactly.
Well said.
Exactly. Renee, it's been super exciting talking to you. And I think we could go on.
Oh my gosh.
For days about your stories and what the work you've been doing, the fact you've been doing this for 30 years. And it feels like you're just kind of coming up on the crest of a wave here. Okay, now we've got some momentum finally about let's deal with it, because it really is on top of mind, which is why we've visited this for the second time in the podcast series.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very, very much for your insights. Maybe we'll have you back again.
Yes, part 3.
Right, part 3 of how it's going. So
awesome.
Great to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Renee.
It's been my honor to be with both of you.
A pleasure.
And do you have a website that we can mention?
I do not. And the reason I don't
Where do people find
is email. And I will say use Renee at diversitydg.ca. And the reason is because I have been doing this for so long, I'm limiting the amount of work that I do. So I am not working full time anymore, which is making me do my happy dance, but I'm still available.
Very, very good.
Wonderful.
She can turn you on to some people who are actually doing additional, right? She's connected. All right. That's it for us on this podcast. I don't know, Sandy, if you've got any parting remarks.
No, I appreciate your time, Renee. It was wonderful to listen to your stories and your insight. And my biggest takeaway is the sincerity of these programs in organizations. And if they're not sincere and you haven't really thought through that, what sincerity looks like, start to finish, then go back to the drawing board.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great
personalized. This has got to be made personal. Yeah, for sure. All right. Talk to you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Right,
you can find
Jen.
Sandy at Satori Consulting, Inc. And you can find her, .ca, not .com. She's in Canada. She's Toronto. And I'm at managementpossible.com, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening, and please visit Sandy's website at satoriconsultinginc.ca. That's SATORI consultinginc.ca, and Jen's website at managementpossible.com. Thanks again.